You know, I am so excited to be here today. It's a privilege to be part of an all-Master's College staff. And the Master's College, as you probably do know, most of you, because a lot of you are from there, including my students, I'd like to first acknowledge them. Would you raise your hand, my students over there? Just raise your hand. Yeah, thank you so much for coming. They get extra credit for being here. Well, this vital subject that is so important to where we come from and where we're to go when we pass away is just a privilege for us to discuss this morning. And I have to tell you, after 30 years of studying this, reading over 6,000 books and physically going out and digging fossils hundreds of times myself, I can say the case for creation is overwhelming. I mean, it may turn out that I'm wrong, but I'm just telling you, I'm banking my very life on the fact that God is creator and He is Savior. And folks, the real scientific evidence does support the case for a literal young earth creation. I have no doubt about that after looking at this all these many years. And so this morning, we want to briefly present some of that evidence. We can't discuss all of it. But we've got the books back there in case you're interested in particular subjects. We'll try to answer your questions and for you to understand that the real scientific evidence does support special creation. Well, you might say, well then why are all these evolutionists committed to the exact opposite, that the earth is old, that man is a product of time and chance, that evolution has occurred? The answer is that that's what they've been told. Many of them have never even heard the evidence or the case for creation. As a young man of 21 years old, not a believer, I had decided to investigate this. I thought in my mind, now the Bible says that God created in a literal 24-hour days and that He is the one that made all this, as it says in the Psalms, that He spoke things into existence. And yet all my science teachers are telling me the opposite. Something's wrong here. My teachers at school are saying, no, that the earth is a product of time and chance and long ages where it created itself. Something is wrong here. So I decided quietly to enroll in some geology classes and began to study this. I can honestly say many years later as a scientist and who's given this careful and thorough study that the case for creation is overwhelming. It's staggering. It's stupendous. And again, I'll state my very life that God is creator and He is Savior, that Jesus Christ has saved us. Now, we want to start by looking at the case for creation and how strong it is. So I will quickly summarize that, and then I want to present one particular aspect on the fossil record. Last time I was here, and many other times I've been here, I've always argued that we do not find intermediate forms. I want to go beyond that to a secondary evidence in my talk today that explains to you that not only do we not find intermediate forms, but what we actually find is organisms that have stayed the same as far back in the fossil record as we can go. In other words, when we find an ant, it still looks like an ant. When we find a coelacanth fish, it still looks exactly the same. The living form looks like the fossil form no matter how far back you go. And in fact, there are so many cases of that, they've created a name for this. It's called living fossils because they look identical. You see, this is very damaging because if evolution is true, we should see progressive changes through time. And in many cases, I'm talking thousands, if not millions of cases, what we see are organisms that haven't even changed a little bit. I can look at the fossil form of that organism and the living form of that organism, and they look identical without any change. This is severely damaging and yet another Achilles heel for the supposed theory of evolution. Okay, we've got the slides on, so let's go to the next slide, please. Now, quickly, I want to talk about the case for creation. You know, it's getting stronger and stronger all the time. There are few creation scientists. We don't get government grants. We don't have public institutions to be able to do the work of creation. We have to do it with private donations and a small number of workers. But what we begin to discover when we've done good, solid academic work is that the real science does support creation. For example, the age of the earth has been shown to very strongly, arguably, be young. The acronym RATE that the Institute for Creation Research did, there's 2 very thick volumes of data out there, where we discovered that many, many geochronometers, that is, clocks that determine the age of the Earth, clearly demonstrate that the Earth is quite young. For example, helium diffusion rates. When radioactive elements, those are elements that are unstable, as they decay out, those change into other elements, and they give off byproducts. One of those byproducts is helium, and we can measure the rate of that helium quite accurately. And when we do, we see that the diffusion rates show that the Earth is quite young, thousands of years, not millions or billions. Other examples, and I'm being quite brief here, you understand, this could be a whole topic, but then, you know, all of you would fall asleep because it's very technical. Coal and diamonds of great age, no matter how far back we go in the fossil record. You can go back to Jurassic or Cretaceous coal, and you will find that that still has carbon in it. You say, well, what does that mean? Well, as a matter of fact, it turns out that the decay rate of carbon-14 shows that we can't accurately date anything beyond a number of thousands of years. And yet these coal seams are alleged to be many millions of years old or hundreds of millions of years old, and yet they still contain great quantities of C14 in it, carbon-14. So if anything, this shows a very young age. Now, there are many other geochronometers listed in those books, or I'll be happy to discuss it further, that demonstrate good, solid evidence that supports the idea that the Earth is quite young. Well, you say, well, then why do evolutionists believe it's so old? Because they are committed to the very death that you have to have an old Earth. You see, ladies and gentlemen, if the Earth is quite young, and the scientific evidence does support that, then evolution's impossible. So they cannot allow the Earth to be young, and yet we have many geochronometers as developed in the RATE project that show that the Earth is quite young. Now that's only a start. When it comes to design arguments, they're getting much stronger. For example, Michael Behe argued many years ago, and the argument is getting even stronger in many different areas, for this idea of irreducibly complex systems, that the systems that we see are a compilation of many different artifacts that make up those systems that could not function individually. For example, in bacteria, there are what are called a flagellar motor. Certain bacteria propel themselves through water with what we can essentially call an outboard motor. And these flagellar motors, they spin at great RPMs. In fact, some are thought to spin up to many tens of thousands of RPMs. And in a quarter turn, they can reverse. And it's so complex, it doesn't function unless all 30 to 40 proteins function together as a unit. If you pull out some of those individual parts, the whole organism fails to function. This shows an organism that was designed. It didn't evolve gradually, slowly and gradually. That's only one of many examples. Blood clotting is another major example. If you think of what your blood is made up, you have red blood cells, you have white blood cells, and then you have blood clotting constituents that they're not actual cells, but they function to clot your blood. And so when you start to bleed, you don't even think about it, but immediately there is a series of enzymatic reactions. It's like a cascade system, and these must function together as a unit. Otherwise, you continue to bleed, as hemophiliacs do, and bleed to death. So the question is, how did that function or evolve slowly and gradually? It could not. It's an irreducibly complex system that had to be designed from the beginning and function as a unit. DNA. Do you know that DNA contains over 3 billion individual characters, sugars, phosphates, and bases, and those are unbelievably well designed. We must ask the question, what is the origin of that information content if DNA evolved on its own? This is a major problem for evolutionists. Even Bill Gates looked at that and he said, wow, this is just as complex as any of my programmers when they design a program. It's an amazing, complex system. In fact, Antony Flew, world-famous atheist Antony Flew, who wrote many books and was an antagonist of Christianity when presented with the evidence for DNA, recanted. He didn't become a Christian, but he did become a deist, a believer in God, after all those years into his 80s. Dr. Flew has now passed on, and I'm certain now that he is a creationist because he knows exactly where he comes from. Whether or not he ever received Christ, we don't know. So there's no explanation for the information content that we see in organisms. Where did that come from? Information always denotes the one that created that information, whoever that may be. It denotes a designer, a programmer, someone who created that information. Information itself does not create itself out of nothing. Nothing can't create something. Dr. Stephen Mayer wrote a book called Signature in the Cell, in which this 500-page book argues strongly that DNA, the best explanation is that it was designed. Otherwise, the question becomes, what is the origin of that information? And the answer the evolutionists come up with is, well, we don't know. It somehow evolved. Well, unless you can demonstrate how that happened, the best explanation is design. So the case for creation is getting stronger. And again, there's no mechanism for evolution. Professor John Sanford, I should say, has argued strongly in his book. We have it back there, by the way. 99% of all mutations are deleterious. They are harmful to systems. Perhaps 1% or even less may have some particular function. But the mutation rate is so great and in such a deleterious state, Dr. Sanford has argued that it'll only take a short time before the entire genome, our genome, that is, all the genes, are basically swamped and we'll cease reproduction in only a few thousand years. That's the implication of this. So the genome itself seems to argue for a young Earth. Otherwise, it would be overwhelmed by the mutation rate. A complete lack of intermediate forms, starting from my mentor, Dr. Duane Gish, who for decades argued with evolutionists and won every time when he pointed out that what we see is a lack of intermediate forms. You see, the fossil record is systematically showing gaps. Every place you need to see an intermediate between a single-cell organism and a multicellular organisms, no intermediates. Between amphibians and reptiles, there are no intermediate forms. Between reptiles and birds, there are no intermediate forms. Between mammals and fossil human beings, we don't find these intermediate forms. The gaps are systematic. Oh, evolutionists will come up with one or two every decade only to be debunked the next generation and try to come up with new ones. But after studying this for 30 years, I can tell you we don't find even one single intermediate form, and we need billions to demonstrate the case for macroevolution through time. The missing links become asserted every generation, only to be debunked in the next generation, and then new ones are proposed, and those are refuted. You see, the one thing that they will not let go of, even if there's no good evidence of it, is evolution. The origin of life. This is something that creationists have pointed out over and over and over again. And you'll have the privilege of hearing Dr. Anderson talk about this, that we don't have an explanation naturalistically for the origin of life. Where does life come from? We, as scientists, we can't create life in a test tube. We can't take living cells and, non-living cells and create living things from them, non-living substances, and create living things from them. This has been completely falsified. Workers like Thaxton, Bradley, and Olson, Gish published many articles on this. Wilder Smith through the years. Wilder Smith had 3 PhDs and published extensively on the origin of life, that we could not account for it naturalistically. And then now you'll hear a fabulous talk by Dr. Anderson to confirm this later on today. Well, did Darwin really know what he was talking about? I don't think so. You say, well, how do you know that? Well, Dr. Jerry Bergman, who himself has at least a couple of PhDs, cites a study in a particular book that he recently came out with. I believe we have copies of it back there, called The Dark Side of Charles Darwin. And he says in there, he has a particular quote. He says, listen to this very carefully now, 3,878 sentences were in the first edition. There were 6 editions of Darwin's book published, and nearly 3,000 of those, about 75%, were rewritten over and over and over through his 6 editions. Why? Because he knew there were issues, there were problems, there were things he couldn't account for, and so he had to keep revising and keep revising. Darwin's main problem is that he had lost his daughter, Annie, at 9 years old and was embittered. I can understand losing your daughter, but Darwin was embittered and blamed God for that. Never thought about perhaps that God was merciful and wanted Annie to stop suffering and wanted Annie to be with him. And so when he began to write his book, he suffered from a number of ailments. He could only write for about 15 minutes before he would start shaking, because I believe he knew what he was doing was wrong. So he goes on in the quote, Bergman does, to say about 75% were rewritten from 1 to 5 times each in Darwin's book on the origin of the species. Over 1,500 sentences were added, and of the original sentences, plus these, nearly 325 were dropped. Nearly 7,500 variants of all kinds in his 6th edition. In terms of net added sentences, the 6th edition is nearly a third again as long as the first. And then down at the bottom there you see Moore and Peckham, 1959 was the original source of this research. And finally, there's a book out, we have it back there also. John has such a great collection. And it's called The Secret of the 6th Edition. Darwin had actually given up on natural selection by the 6th edition because he knew it failed to explain the origin of the information content. You must explain where information comes from on its own, because as I've already indicated, it doesn't come it isn't self-created. Now look, we need to start looking at science from biblical glasses, and I realize all of my education and all of the other speakers' educations, we were educated in public secular universities. We were taught that evolution was a fact, but despite that, we know that's not correct. Still, our training has influenced the way we look at the information. Many creation scientists then have been trained by evolutionists, and because of this, we don't always look at things correctly. We don't always look at the universe through biblical glasses, and that's one thing that we need to really be careful to do. For example, in the year 2010, Dr. Marcus Ross said, quote, and honestly, no young Earth creationists expected soft tissue to be found in dinosaurs, because all of our training, dinosaurs are the classic, exhibit 1 of evolution, supposedly, and yet no one, including the creationists, expected such overwhelming evidence that we would find soft tissue still preserved in dinosaurs. If you understand the implication here, it's impossible. Many of you saw that movie, Planet of the Apes, and at the end, towards the end, they go into a cave and they find a little baby doll, and the baby doll says, "Mama," and the apes didn't want that to be known because it showed that humans spoke before the apes, and that was Blasphemy in the movie. Ooh, we can't let that information get out. Well, this is the same kind of a case. In this particular example, soft tissue preserved for 70 million years. How do you do that? Unless they're not 70 million years old. Tremendous evidence, again, outside of those geochronometers, those earth clocks, that argues strongly that the earth is perhaps quite young. Well, we want to try to look at the fossil record then through biblical glasses and not look at it from an evolutionary perspective. Despite all of my degrees and our other speakers' degrees, we're trying to discover the actual evidence based on an eyewitness, our Creator, Lord Jesus Christ. So what does the fossil record actually show? And as I've propounded for many years, it shows a lack of intermediate forms, systematic gaps in the fossil record, no intermediate forms between major taxonomic groups. It shows extinction, many taxonomic groups of organisms that are no longer extant. For example, dinosaurs and dodo birds, these are extinct. And also what we want to focus on now, stasis. So in the past, I've always focused on the intermediate forms, but I came across a book just a couple of years ago here, and we have this back there also. It's called Living Fossils by Dr. Kurt Warner. Now, Dr. Warner is not a scientist per se. He's a medical doctor. I suppose we could say that is a type of scientist. Certainly, he's educated in science knowledge. And Dr. Warner traveled over 250,000 miles going to every major museum in the world and looking at the fossils and examining the fossils, taking pictures of the fossils, and interviewing the paleontology curators at all of these at all of these museums, I should say. And the thing that he found that was quite shocking is there are an abundance of organisms that have not evolved, but are the same today, identically the same as what we find in the fossil record with organisms that are said to be millions, tens of millions, or even hundreds of millions of years old. Now, I had always known about this evidence, but never had consciously thought there were that many. In most of my paleontology presentations, I would list a few what we call living fossils, organisms that hadn't changed, and I thought that's interesting. It really doesn't show any evidence of evolution. But Dr. Warner has codified that there are an abundance of organisms that haven't changed at all. Ladies and gentlemen, that's impossible if evolution has occurred. You understand that if evolution has occurred on a macro scale, we should see in the fossil record microscopic organisms. These should change into multicellular organisms, into higher order organisms, and finally evolve into man. And this is what we should see. This is so damaging. It's very much like the little baby doll that Taylor in the Planet of the Apes movie found, and it said, "Mama, here it is. Here's Mama." Okay? So what we want to do now is focus the rest of our talk on what we call stasis. I'll be defining these terms as we go. Many examples of what are called living fossils, organisms that are alive today that are identical no matter how far back you go in the fossil record. That shouldn't be. It should not be the case. That is why this is yet another Achilles heel for the evolutionists. It does not fit the data for evolution, but it very rightly and correctly would fit what we should expect if the Earth is quite young. And organisms have, yes, they perhaps changed a little, but at the same level of complexity, but not evolution at the macro scale. So taxonomic groups, that's groups of plants and animals that are categorized, have not changed or evolved through time. No macroevolution, as we call it. Small scale changes, yes, no problem. As we look in this room, human beings are not all identical. We have people with light skin, people with dark skin, people that are tall, people that have big builds, people that are short, people that have slight builds. These variational changes are at the same level of complexity. That is not evolution, folks. We must see in the fossil records change from simple organisms to complex, not change at the same level of complexity. So those alive today are basically the same, in many cases, referred to as living fossils. So let's get into some definitions here so you can understand what I'm really talking about. Next slide. Stasis in the fossil record. Let me quote from D.S. Woodruff in the journal Science 1980. He says, but fossil species remain unchanged throughout most of their history. And the record fails to contain a single example of a significant transition. Whoa. Now that's very damaging because Woodruff is an evolutionist. If there were intermediate forms, he would want them to be found. Further, let me quote from Stephen Jay Gould in Evolution's Erratic Pace, Natural History, Volume 86. He says this, 1977. Most species exhibit no direct change during their tenure on Earth. They appear in the fossil record looking much the same as when they disappear. Morphological change is usually limited and directionless. Okay, so you might have some organisms that are slightly bigger for protection, or organisms that are slightly smaller because there's less food. Natural selection, but this is not evolution. You must go from simple to complex. We don't find that in the fossil record. So let me continue to quote. Here's another quote from Stephen Gould. Despite this strong belief in geological gradualism, that is the slow gradual change of organisms, Darwin knew perfectly well, as all paleontologists always have, that stasis, that is organisms staying the same through time, and abrupt appearance, when we first see them, that's what they look like, is a norm for the observed history of most species. Wow. And yet Gould was an evolutionist. Why? Because he was a Marxist atheist, not because the science dictated that he be that, but rather because of his presuppositions on where we come from. The science didn't lead him there, his presuppositions did. All right, now, let's go ahead and define what a living fossil actually is so we can begin to see examples of some. Next slide, good. Living fossils are organisms, that is plants and animals, alive today that are virtually identical to those found as fossil specimens in the rocks. Okay, I'm quoting from a PhD evolutionist, so as not to bias the case for creation, Dr. Niles Eldridge, who has been at the American Museum of Natural History for many years, committed evolutionist, but he's certainly agreeing with us that there are many living fossils. There seems to have been almost no change, he goes on to say, in any part we can compare between the living organisms and its fossilized progenitors of the remote geologic past. Living fossils embody the theme of evolutionary stability, well, really, to an extreme degree. We have not completely solved the riddle of living to an extreme degree. There seems to have been some almost no change in any part we can compare between the living organisms and its fossil progenitors of the remote geologic past. So he admits there are organisms, no matter how far back you go, and I will demonstrate that in just a minute, that are the same. They're identical. But you're raising your hand saying, I thought evolution was change through time. That's what it is. It's change on the macro scale, from simple organisms to complex. So here we have very prominent PhD paleontological evolutionists that are admitting that what we actually see is little or no change at all. Did you see a contradiction already? Now, there is variation, but that variation is at the same level of complexity. Organisms do have variety. Human beings, we've mentioned, or varieties of dogs, varieties of cats, or frogs, whatever you want to name. There's a number of reasons for variation, and I believe the creator-designer put those into the genome specifically because we do need to live in a number of different environments. Northern Europeans, for example, are very fair-skinned because there's not a lot of sunlight, and they need to get that extra quantity of sunlight to synthesize vitamin D. Africans have the exact opposite problem. There's a large amount of ultraviolet rays in those areas. You need darker skin for protection. So variation at the same level of complexity that would help you for adaptation, but not evolution. So recombination is one of the biggest ones. Your genes are constantly shuffled. The recombination of DNA can cause a large mixing of genes. Independent assortment, for example, crossing over. These are mechanisms that shuffle those genes. Sexual dimorphism is another same level of complexity type of variation. Females are usually smaller than males. For example, in human beings, females are average about 3 inches shorter than males across populations. Selection, you get differences in diet, climate, and stress, as I mentioned, that cause minor variational changes. Organisms become the most comfortable in their environment. I cited, for example, the differences in skin color for humans, which have become almost irrelevant now. We have air conditioning, heating, central heating, good clothing, suntan lotion. We don't really need that much anymore. Genetic isolation can certainly cause variation, what we call the founder effect, bottleneck effect, where only a certain number of genes, say organisms are blown out to sea, they land on an island, so only a small percentage of the total genes are isolated in a particular area, and so this is a reason for selection and variation. But none of these examples that do cause variation are examples of evolution. Now, here's an example of the kind of variation I'm talking about. If we found different varieties of dogs, next slide, we would perhaps, paleontological, give these different genera and species names. Here we see Canis familiaris, but look at the dramatic differences in the skeleton between this Doberman and this bulldog. Certainly, we would classify them as two different species, but nonetheless, there's that variety at the same level of complexity that can be selected for, but that's not evolution. Look at the skulls between these two specimens, and you can see dramatically these would most certainly be classified as different species or even different genera if found in the fossil record, and yet variety at the same level of complexity is a far better explanation than evolution would be. Okay, next slide. I'm sorry, I keep forgetting to say next slide. Now, we need to understand how the naming of these organisms occurred in order to understand what I'm going to say later on in the talk. All organisms, when found, living or fossil, are given names by the use of what we call binomial nomenclature. That is the two names, the genus and species. Two names, example, for man, human beings, the scientific name Homo sapiens, or man the wise. Living organisms can be checked to see if they are indeed the same genera or species. A species is usually defined as a population that is capable of interbreeding and producing fertile offspring. So obviously, elephants and giraffes are not related to each other, and they're both mammals, but that's at a far higher taxonomic level and not capable of interbreeding. So organisms are classified a little bit different for plants and animals, but here we see the classification for Homo sapiens, kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, and so forth, all the way down to the scientific name Homo sapiens. And also on the other side, your right-hand side, is the classification of plants, which is slightly different, but still systematically at different levels. Now, here's where this becomes relative to our talk. When we look at the fossil record, evolutionists tend to assume that every organism that is even slightly different is a different species. And here's a classic example of a mistake that was made. Here we find a particular fossil organism in my field of study referred to as Ramapithecus. For many years, Ramapithecus, which is on the right, and the living organism on the left is considered a different species. I'll tell you what that is in just a second. Well, actually, it says up there it's an orang on the left, on your left. And the fossil Ramapithecus was thought to be the intermediate between humans and apes for many years. It's supposed to be 17 million years old. It's supposed to have characteristics that are somewhat ape-like and a suite of characteristics that are somewhat human-like, a clear intermediate. Up until the 1970s, all evolutionists maintain that this was an example of the missing link, our ancestors. And yet, as it turns out, that was completely false based on the concept of classification, that, this is an extinct organism. Well, now let's get into why that's relative, naming fossils. With fossil specimens, you cannot check if they can breed in this particular case. There's no knowledge whether or not that Ramapithecine was related to any other kinds of organisms or not. So it's based purely on the anatomy, the morphology, or the forms. Therefore, if the organisms are extinct, you must depend on that anatomy. For example, comparing the specimen, you discover with other fossils whether or not it's the same or whether it's a different species. Fossil nomenclature can then be named based on the location, anatomy, or even after a particular friend. For example, Canis rossensis. Okay, a new species of dog named for my good friend, Dr. Ross Anderson. But actually, there is no such thing. It's just my choice when I find an organism. Now, back to what we want to say about that Ramapithecine. As it turns out, as you saw, let me go back quickly. You see the orang. Thank you. Go right there. Perfect. Sorry. As you see the orang on your left and the fossil Ramapithecine on your right, they seem to be dramatically similar, and yet because one is ancient in the fossil record, it's given a totally different name, and it's thought to be our evolutionary ancestors. Okay, now go 1, 2 slides ahead. 2 slides ahead, 1 more. Oh, wait, no, that's the correct, I'm sorry, go back. There, perfect. On the left, then, is the skull of a contemporary orang, and on the right is the jawbone of this famous Ramapithecus. As observed, Ramapithecus cannot be distinguished from an orang, both in terms of its mandibular structure and teeth characteristics. Why? Because this is a classic example of a living fossil. It's been given the name Ramapithecus, and then go to the next slide here. Here's all a series of synonyms for this particular individual specimen thought to be our evolutionary ancestor, and every one of them turned out to be exactly like living orangs. Why? Because it is a fossil orang, a living organism alive today that has not evolved, but thought to be your evolutionary ancestor. So by giving it different taxonomic names, Ramapithecus wickeri, Ramapithecus punjabicus, Kenapithecus wickeri, Sivapithecus indicus, one is left with the impression that there has been evolution, when in fact, all they've done is take an extinct organism, but it's not extinct, it's identical to the living orang, and given it different names and told you that that is your evolutionary ancestor. Now, you might say, oh, well, this is just one little mistake or something, and, perhaps they just thought that it had evolved, and then, later on they realized their mistake. Well, that's fine. But the problem is, this is the norm. There are thousands of cases where these organisms that are identical to living forms have been given other taxonomic names so that you think evolution has occurred. And unless you take, your entire life to investigate this, you would never know. Oh, the fossil fragments of that, they kind of look like a, orangutan, but I don't know. The experts say that they've evolved. No, they have not. All of these genera and species named come from the genus Pongo, but it turns out they're all the living orang, not evolution at all. In fact, there's been no change whatsoever. A living fossil, said by the evolutionists to be 17 million years old. Guess what it looks like? A modern orang. No changes. Modern orang. And in fact, now they've taken that out of their arguments for an evolutionary ancestor. In fact, when I was in graduate school, one of the other students said, it's like my Aunt Bessie died. Yeah, that's right. Okay, now, I want to document this case much, much further. You say, well, maybe that's an aberration. Maybe they just made a mistake one time. No, I don't think so. There are examples of thousands of living fossils. Here's a particular website that I found called livingfossils.com. Boy, they got a .com everything nowadays, don't they? The following slides are from this livingfossil.com. I'm probably going to mispronounce his name, Heron. I don't even know how you say it. Yahya, I guess. A pen name used by Mr. Adan Okar, who is a Muslim. Muslims, of course, don't believe in Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, but they are creationists. And this is a particular Muslim scientist who agrees with us that living fossils are all over the place. Okay, here's one example. Paul, how am I doing for time? About 10 minutes. Okay, I think I can make it. I'll have to hurry. A fossil maple leaf dated back to millions of years. And we compare that to modern living maple leaves. And guess what, folks? They're identical. You say, well, what about the color difference? Well, you have to understand something. The color fades away because of the fossilization process. But in its shape and structure, even though these maple leaves are millions of years old, they look identical to modern maple leaves. A salamander fossil, it's supposed to be 160 million years old, the same basic structure as modern salamanders. No difference whatsoever, okay? These are taken at different angles, by the way, so that's why they're not the exact same size. But even size differences are not what we're talking about here. You must have characteristic differences, not organisms that identically can be identified as a modern salamander that go back 160 million years. Here's a 2 million-year-old fossil ant preserved in amber, and guess what it looks like? A modern ant. And when it comes to insects, we find an abundance of characteristics from every single taxonomic group of insects that are identical to modern insects. It's not just this one example that I'm short on time, so I can't, present ad nauseum. It's not just ants, it's bees, wasps, you name it. They all look identical to modern forms and yet are said to be millions of years old. If evolution is true, you have to have change through time. We don't find that in tens of thousands of cases. And even the cases we do find are relative to extinction, not evolution. And we don't find the intermediate forms on top of all that. Here's a fossil feather said to be 120 million years old, identical to a modern fossil feather, both from the same kind of bird, identical in shape and structure, no change through time. A fossil flower, a primrose. You can see the fossil on your right, although it's a little smaller in the picture. It's hard to get these, identical size. Some are taken from different distances with cameras, but that's not the point. The shape, the structure, and even the species is identical in these fossil organisms. Another example, snake fossils dating back millions of years show that snakes have never changed whatsoever. They're identical to modern snakes. No change. The same identical skeletal structure. How could that be the case if organisms have evolved? Here's what we call a woodpecker feather, which is identical to a present-day woodpecker feather. The oldest known flowering plants are identical to modern-day forms. I'm going to have to go fast. I'm running low on time. The fossil sea urchin on the left and living sea urchins, they're identical. We don't find changes between them, and yet these are said to be tens of millions of years old. They have not evolved at all. They're the same. Here we see a dragonfly compared to a living dragonfly. The fossil dragonfly, which you actually see on your left there, is said to be 150 to 200 million years old. Guess what it looks like? Identical to modern dragonflies. No change through time whatsoever. Fossil bats from the Eocene. Here's the world's oldest known fossil bat on the right-hand side there, said to be 50 million years old. It looks identical to modern bats. Not only does it look identical to modern bats, but it has echolocation, a series of particular morphological characteristics in the skull showing that it had the complex echolocation sonar system that is able to pick out, particular food sources like insects from the very beginning. How did that evolve? What is the origin of that information content? The classic case, the coelacanth. The first of these, found as fossils, supposedly from the Cretaceous time period, found well and, fully functional off the coast of South Africa in 1938, identical to its fossil form, said to be 70 million years old. No evolution whatsoever in the coelacanth. Another example, the horseshoe crab. 450 million year old horseshoe crab. We see its fossils, and the living form is identical. No change whatsoever in the horseshoe crab after 450 million years of said-be evolution. 146 to 65 million year old nautilus, and its identical living form and fossil form are the same. No change through time. Fossil ginkgo trees, dating back to 125 million years. The present ginkgo, there you see the leaf on the right, the fossil on the left, no change whatsoever. Okay, Australian lungfish from the Devonian time period, according to evolutionists. Now, I don't accept these time periods, but I'm using their own arguments. 360 million years before present, BP, and the modern forms look identical. We do see some differences due to the fossilization, not because of evolution. Again, a better example of a fossil ginkgo. Here's the species of that fossil ginkgo, identical in shape and structure, no change, and yet this particular organism is said to be hundreds of million years old. The lamprey, which is a kind of jawless fish, this particular individual attaches to other organisms and then begins to eat it. We see the fossil lampreys on the right from the Devonian, 360 million years before present. Guess what? No evolutionary change whatsoever, identical in the fossil record to modern forms. The platypus, unevolved, found in the 1800s. They thought it was a hoax when Europeans first discovered this because it has a bill like a duck. It has a tail very much like beavers. It has webbed feet, and it lays eggs, and yet it's a mammal. And there is no change whatsoever from the earliest fossils. Here we see two particular skulls from the bottom side up. On the top is a fossil platypus, and it is a little bit larger, but other than that, they're the same. No change through time in its basic structure, and yet the platypus is said to be hundreds of millions of years old. Size, in many cases, is the only difference between these types of organisms at all, and that's simply due to the environment, whether or not they get enough food. Recent post-flood variation may have been more significant as organisms adapted to environments that had no competitors in them. For example, variation or varieties in horses. Now, here's the key to the whole presentation. Fossil specimens that are identical or nearly identical are given different scientific names to give you the implied assumption that organisms have evolved through times. As we see in example 1, a particular horseshoe crab, and yet in living forms it's given a very different genus and species name. Shrimps is another example. I could give thousands of examples which are listed in this book. For living organisms is given one scientific name. The fossil type is given a very different scientific name to imply that evolution has occurred when it hasn't. Look at these horseshoe crabs again closely. You see that the fossil specimen looks identical to the living form. Okay? Mammals. Now, this is so important. I'm going to run out of time here. I only have about 3 minutes left, but I'm going to plow through this quickly, and then during the question and answer, I'll hope that you'll ask more questions so I can give better explanations. It was thought before the 1800s that dinosaurs were a very different time period than mammals were. We know, and it was called the age of mammals. Dinosaurs supposedly went extinct 65 million years before present. But now today we know we have over 300 genera of fossil mammals found intermixed with the dinosaur bones. Okay? I have a quote to this effect. I can easily document that mammals are well known and well established to have been alive at the day of the dinosaurs. In fact, we have over 100 complete mammal skeletons from the dinosaur period. We even have, if someone wants to ask me about this, I can show you where the website is. We even have a fossil mammal with a baby Sitcosaurus, a type of dinosaur, in its mouth. I should say in its stomach that it digested And so mammals are known to have eaten dinosaurs. That's right. I can document that. From every taxonomic group, whether it's the chordates, the echinoderms, the arthropods, the mollusks, you name it, all are found at the same time as the dinosaurs. Look at these organisms that you recognize. Go to the next slide, please. Next slide. And you will see that many of the same types of organisms alive today were alive at the times of the dinosaurs, living fossils. There's a Triceratops, and look at all these living organisms that are alive today. Next slide. Okay, and as we go to the next slide, we see the same kind of thing. Many, many organisms alive today are identical to fossil organisms found at the time of the dinosaurs. No evolution. Next slide, please. And so the same is true for plants. Okay, we want to go back one. Back one slide, thank you. The same is true for plants. Recognizable plants alive today, all the way from ferns to flowering plants alive today, were identical in the fossil record. Here is a list of, on the next slide, of all the types of plants alive today, from magnolias to conifers to ferns, you name it, were alive at the times of the dinosaurs. They have not changed through time. They are the same. Okay, next slide, please. Now, 2 more slides and I'm done. The evolutionist response. You say, well, you know, don't evolutionists know this? What do they think about that? I recently read an article in Discovery Magazine where they said, oh, well, these organisms, there's only a few of them. Oh, I don't think so. There's tens of thousands of living fossils. And they'll say, well, these are uniquely adapted, you see. Look at the second bullet. It says, a few robust creatures, however, have remained remarkably unchanged since antiquity. Such living fossils owe their staying power to a combination of flexibility and uncanny ability to inhabit ecological niches with little competition and a healthy dose of good fortune. So we owe it all to luck, according to this particular author. Well, that's impossible. We have tens of thousands of living fossils in every environment. It certainly isn't a result of luck. What it actually is, go to the next slide. Here is the real conclusions we can take away that I want you to take with you for today. Thousands, or more likely millions, of living fossils exist, organisms that have not changed through time. All of these are uniquely adapted. A lack of change in the fossil record argues powerfully for stasis, that most organisms stay the same or they become extinct, which is the opposite of macroevolution. In conclusion, this supports the contention that the Earth is young and we are not the product of evolution, time, and chance, but rather the fossil record, both in extinction, in lack of intermediate forms, and in stasis, argues very powerfully and strongly for creation and not evolution. Thank you very much.